Good morning. We're going to do lecture 17C. We'll get into today's lesson. Let me sip some coffee. Okay, we're going to talk about becoming a world power today. If you've watched or looking at the slides, there is a video before this that deals with imperialism. We will watch it. We won't put the film on while we're doing that, but I encourage you to watch. It goes over some key things of imperialism. So today, becoming world power, imperialism is a big part of this lesson. So, new imperialism. In world history, the last quarter of the 19th century is known as the Age of Imperialism. European empires carved up large parts of the world among themselves. The United States, for the most of this period, remained a second-rate power and did not heavily get involved in a lot of conquest around the world. Where you see most of this occur is in Africa and parts of Asia, and this is predominantly done by the British, the French, the Germans will get into it later in the century, but they're carving up large chunks of land and they're taking control over it. Imperialism, by definition, is to dominate another country economically, politically, and militarily. They may remain a country, but they will be dominated by the other. The British in India was a good example of that as well. Now, new imperialism was Belgium, Great Britain, and France consolidated their holds in colonies in Africa, where newly unified Germany acquired colonies as well. So the new imperialism will be more aggressive expansion into Africa. So the original imperialism focused on Asia, such as China, India, parts of the Caribbean and such, where the new imperialism will focus on really trying to aggressively carve up Africa. By the early 20th century, most of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East and the Pacific have been divided among those empires, and this is going to shape a lot of 20th century conflicts as well. American expansionism, up until the mid-1890s, America did not get involved outside of the Americas. The first acquisition we will get will be Hawaii, which we will probably talk about here in a little bit. I don't know if I have it referenced, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. The United States was starting to emerge as a trade and needed to expand and needed some naval bases mostly. So the lure of empire, American missionaries had ventured out throughout the 1800s, but now Americans are going to start to expand economically, politically, and want to be like the rest of Europe. Small group actively promoted American expansionism. A guy named Alfred T. Mahan wrote the book, "In the Influence of Sea Power Upon History," argued that no nation could prosper without a strong navy that could trade internationally. This influenced James Blaine, Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison, and the United States will embark from really this point on and really looking at building a better navy. That's why when Teddy Roosevelt had served as Secretary of the Undersecretary to the Navy before becoming president, realized the importance of naval forces, and he helped expand naval forces prior to World War I. Now, with this increase in naval spending, we need bases for coal to refuel and stops. One of the earliest places we looked to was Hawaii. We annexed it after several years of sugar farmer influence. We just basically went in and took Hawaii, made it a territory. That is, for the most part, the definition of imperialism. There was no war really fought. The last queen of Hawaii will die, and we will just annex it, and it'll become a U.S. territory. It won't become a state until the 50s, but we take and acquire Hawaii. New mass circulation newspapers promoted national sentiments as well. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer will write articles promoting Americanization of things and American nationalism. They also practice what's called yellow press, yellow journalism, the fake news of the day. Fake news often contains a nugget of truth with a lot of falseness. Yellow journalism is the same thing. It just was done as newspapers in a different format than we're accustomed to today. But they will spur up American belief, American public support, and opinion. This is going to really galvanize what we know with the what we call the Splendid Little War. Cuba was struggling to gain their independence in a movement of independence against Spain. Spain is a failing empire at this point. They had conquested the Americas in the 1500s. Now, by the turn of the 1900s, late 1800s, they are falling apart. They've lost pretty much all their colonies, all their land they had acquired. They're trying to hold on. Cuba has one of their last strongholds, and they want independence. Reports circulated of widespread suffering and demands for intervention grew. The Yellow Press with Hearst and Pulitzer are going to basically see how bad the Spanish are. The USS Maine is sent there to kind of to be a negotiating piece between the Cubans and the Spanish, because we're trying to come in and say, hey, we're going to help the Cubans, right? Well, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor on February 15th, 1898, blowing up. Of course, U.S. press is going to say that we're attacked. It's all the Spanish. McKinley will ask Congress for war. Made it known they would not. They also said we're not going to annex Cuba, but the USS Maine was attacked by the Cubans, not Cubans, but the Spanish. We were going to defend them and defend their honor. We're going to go and do the right thing. Well, the Maine most likely blew up from a boiler leak. It had a boiler, it was coal driven. They think it was driven from that. There's a possibility it might have hit a Spanish mine, but the most likely reality, it was a malfunction. But that doesn't matter. This is a galvanizing for a war, or sometimes called the Splendid Little War. Congress will back McKinley's declaration of war. And if you look at the primary source, the reaction quiz for this week, it goes into the headline of McKinley asking for war on that front page. First major battle took place in Manila Bay, where Admiral George Dewey defeated a Spanish fleet. Manila Bay isn't the Philippines, so the first major battle is not even in Cuba, which is just off the coast of Florida. The first major battle will be all the way across in the Spanish Philippine Islands. Here's a painting from the time period of the Maine exploding. If you look at the painting closely, you can see closely random men in the air, which I think is pretty dramatic for a painting, just seeing people go into their death. But the idea is it evokes emotion. Okay, becoming a world power number 3. One of the most famous men from this little war is going to be a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had San Juan Hill. Roosevelt had volunteered. He led a group called the Rough Riders. The charge up San Juan Hill made him famous. He had already been a rising political star in the country, but this galvanizes him with public support. A nation no name, Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Roosevelt came from money, but he was a self-made man. He had been very sickly as a boy, and some said he would never walk or be able to do a lot of things, but obviously, as you can see, he made himself a military officer, and obviously a political career that went on. Roosevelt's pretty awesome to study when you study him in detail. After the war, he'd be elected governor of New York, and then became McKinley's vice president in 1900. So, Roosevelt, a very important player in this very short-lived war, but makes a very strong name for himself. An American empire. The United States won the war. It lasted less than a year. In the treaty that ended the war, the United States gained the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific island of Guam. So we gained significant territory in this little war. Now, don't be fooled. This war was about expansion. We could care less about Cuba for the most part. We wanted some Spanish land. So we gained the Philippines, which we no longer have. We gave that back after World War II. But Puerto Rico and the island of Guam are still American territories. And Puerto Rico has obviously been the one that's been heavily talked about potentially becoming a U.S. state. We will see if that ever happens. I think it will happen at some point. But that is when we acquire those lands. Cuba gained its independence. We did have the Platt Amendment, so Cuba gets its independence from Spain. But we put an amendment in that would basically the U.S. would intervene at any time if they saw fit if Cuba needed it. Meaning, hey, we can come in and help Cuba anytime they need help. Well, that will be eventually removed, but this shows you that we have a strong interest in staying in Cuba. Also, we will get a permanent naval base that we leased at Guantanamo Bay. And we still have that base at Guantanamo Bay, by the way. It's just a little, basically, installation on Cuba that we own. We got it after this war. That's where all the terrorists have been sent instead of the United States, because it's not U.S. soil. Open door policy will also become an American policy. China open to all. The British will use this policy pretty effectively, and we will advocate it as well. Anyone can come into China. So as America expands and the British and all these other countries have expanded, the one policy they're going to use in China is basically China is open to all for trading and money grabbing. The Chinese don't want this, but the Chinese are powerless to stop all of this. Okay, becoming a world power 4. The Filipino War, or the Philippine War. Now, at first, the Filipinos and Puerto Ricans welcomed the Americans. This changed after the United States decided to keep the territories and not give them sovereignty or control. Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of the Philippines, led a revolt in 1899 to 1903 against the United States. His revolt will not achieve its goal at that point, And honestly, it takes Howard Taft, or future President Taft, to go to the Puerto Rico to stabilize it. That being said, there'll be contentions in the Philippines all the way up until World War II. Puerto Rico became a low-wage plantation economy. We didn't develop it very highly in this early era, and it's kind of what it predominates today. It's not very rich, low agrarian society. But this Philippine War, not a good mark for us, obviously, as we're trying to enter the world stage. Citizens are subject. The American system of government had provisions for permanent colonies. Four-Acre Act of 1900 declared Puerto Rico as an insular territory. Citizens were Puerto Rican, not American. This will change later on. In insular cases, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution did not fully apply to the territories recently acquired. Interesting little tidbit there, that the Constitution does not apply to these new territories. Hawaii took a traditional route and became a state. Philippines achieved its independence in 1946 after World War II. Puerto Rico, called the world's oldest colony, because it's been a colony since 1493, technically, when the Spanish took it over. And they, obviously, if you watch the news, Puerto Rico is in dire straits after the last hurricane. Guam remains an unincorporated territory the United States still basically controls. There's not a huge population there to begin with, and it's mostly a military installation. Now, Puerto Ricans today, I do believe, can be considered U.S. citizens. Drawing the global color line, white man's burden, white man will help the inferior races. This is one of the ways, looking at becoming a world power, number 5, that Americans, the British, the French, and so on, justified them going into these countries. We need to help these poor African countries, these poor Asian countries. They're uncivilized. They need to be taught industrialization. They need to be taught the white way. A very, very, very convoluted way to look at it. In other classes, I've used the word Anglo-Saxonism belief structure, meaning white man prevails or white man is better. And this is very much the case at this point. And honestly, when you even look at World War I is a white man's war for the most part, and control of certain areas. So this is a prevailing thought at this time, and it's not a good one. Republic or empire. Opponents formed the Anti-Imperialist League. There'll be anti-imperialist in the United States. The Americans' expansion was benevolent imperialism, we argued, in the government. Spread liberty and help uplift backward culture. So that's going back to that white superiority belief. McKinley will be reelected in 1900 pretty easily, with a new vice president, Teddy Roosevelt. America was positioned to take its place among the best in the world. Teddy Roosevelt was put as vice president because he was an up-and-coming Republican, but a lot of Republicans feared he was too radical when they wanted to essentially bury him, and so they put him as vice president, hoping to silence him and appease his appetite for political upward movement. Honestly, the vice president is a career killer in some cases. It's not till recent years do vice presidents actually run to be president. This was not the standard at the time. It's not really the first vice president to run for election himself was really Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. So anyway, imperialism quickly comes, quickly goes, but by the turn of the century, 1900s, America is finding itself now in a very, very much different role. So as a recap for Chapter 17, we talked about the populist movement, farmers trying to change their positions in society. We've talked about a little bit of the industrialization of the country and transformation. We talked a lot about segregation, how the South suppressed blacks' rights and they went backwards. We talked about immigration policy a little bit. We talked about now becoming a world power. There's a lot of stuff in this Chapter 17 that's important that will shape what's going to become Chapter 18 and 19. Okay. Good job this week. I'll probably go through and finish grading up to Chapter 15, 16 quizzes here, and 17 quizzes. 17 reaction quizzes up. Make sure you get that done. It's due by next Monday. Chapter 17 chapter quiz will be posted Friday, and it will be 25 points. Make sure you're staying on top of that. The reaction quiz does dive into primary source about the start of World War I. Also, please email me if you have questions or concerns, and let me know of anything else that you need. Have a great day, great weekend. Stay warm. Go Chiefs.